You're watching a recording from the Joint Public Issues Team National Conference 2020. In this session, we're digging deeper into theology with Anthony Reddie.
As Rachel mentioned before, my name's Ross Greer. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Green Party. I represent the West of Scotland, and up until last year I was a member of the Church of Scotland's National Youth Assembly. I've not left the church, I'm simply too old to be a member of the National Youth Assembly anymore. I am clinging to the idea I'm still the youngest member of the Scottish Parliament, so I'm holding on to that one. I'm delighted to be here with Anthony this morning for this discussion. The format we're going to go with is we've got a set list of questions that will take about 25-30 minutes to really draw out some of the stuff that Anthony was saying this morning, and for the second half we will throw it open to yourselves. So you'll see on your seats there are bits of paper that if you wish to write down a question that myself or Steve will read out for you, that's absolutely fine. Have a think about that while we're discussing, and then at the start of the Q&A, if you just stick your hand up with that, we'll come round and collect them. But we'll also allow folk to say it in your own words if you prefer. And at this point, I should say, I find it's very useful if you say right at the start of a discussion, the first 3 questions that we're going to take are all going to be from women. That tends to drastically improve the quality of the Q&A. And I've got one final caveat. My journey here yesterday was supposed to take 4.5 hours, but it took 8.5, and it went well into early this morning. If I'm yawning while you're talking, please don't take it personally. I'm fired up on coffee, but I don't know how long that will last. So with that, I think we will just get started. And I'm interested to start off with on some of the discussion that Anthony was contributing to this morning around this relation of UK race and empire and how that factors in to tackling the climate crisis. So the first question that I've got for you, Anthony, is can the UK actually deliver? Can we be a net contributor towards climate justice if we don't first have a national reckoning, or to use a less charged phrase, a national conversation about our past and our present attitude towards race, empire and colonialism?
So in a word, no, but obviously, like Robert would probably say a bit more than that. So Paul Gilroy, one of our most eminent black academics in Britain, cultural theorist, sociologist, historian, a number of years ago said that Britain is suffering from post-colonial melancholy. Post-colonial melancholy. In my own words, so I'm on Twitter. My most popular tweet is this. So if you remember nothing else, well, hopefully you will remember more than this. It's this tweet. Actually about Brexit. So I wrote a book last year called Theology Brexit. And I said that Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. So here's the thing. As of 1918 and the Balfour Declaration, when Britain acquired Palestine as a protectorate, we either owned, ran, controlled 24% of the world. So the largest empire the world has ever seen. It's those bits in pink on the old maps and globes. The sun literally never set on the British Empire if you went from the east in terms of the Pacific, in terms of New Zealand, Pacific Islands, right through to Canada and the west, and all points between. We got rich on the exploitation of others. It's as simple as that. And the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen if you don't have the capital in order to fund that. And that comes from exploitation. It comes from slavery and it comes from colonialism. Empire went. But our sense of exceptionalism, particularly English exceptionalism, more accurately white English exceptionalism, has not gone. And so what we have at the moment is an existential crisis, because what has happened is much, if you've ever had chickenpox, I had it when I was 7 years old. You think you're cured. And then at some point, usually to do with stress and other environmental factors, it comes back big time, as shingles. What we are experiencing at the moment is a form of shingles in terms of post-colonial melancholy. We are wrestling with our sense of identity, and what we needed and should have always had is a national conversation about empire, about what does it do to the psyche of a people to believe themselves to be possessed of a kind of manifest destiny. And my work is called Theologizing Brexit because the church and theology is culpable in it. In 1857, David Livingstone, former LMS, I used to work for the Council for World Mission, and his previous situation was the London Missionary Society. So he was a missionary in southern Africa, in North and South Rhodesia. And he said in 1857 in Oxford, where I work, I think at Merton College, he said, the base of the British Empire is the 3 C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity becomes the theological and philosophical underpinning of empire, which is first and foremost commerce. It's about making money. It's about taking resources from other people. So whether it's rubber from Indonesia, or whether it's human labour from Africa, whether it's cotton and sheep and various other things from New Zealand, it is about empire that enriches us. So it's commerce. It's civilization in the sense in which that sense of manifest destiny Britain believes itself to be superior to, and if you look at the literature in many mission agencies, there's a clear sense in which the British, particularly the English, saw the empire as proof of God's blessing. We know God loves us because look at the size of empire. If God didn't want it to happen, it wouldn't have happened. So there's a sense of manifest destiny. That is still there. We have never come to terms with that. And in actual fact, not only have we not come to terms with it, what you have now are apologists who are trying to argue for the benign nature of empire. So, in Oxford, I have a leading person in our department called Nigel Bigger. Obviously, in saying this and this being filmed, you know that there'll be no promotion for me anytime soon in Oxford. And Nigel Bigger is an ethicist who argues that not only was empire good, benign, it's a good thing. And actually, we don't need to apologise because actually it's that old Rudyard Kipling sense of the white man's burden. We brought civilization. We did a favour to these benighted peoples. Therefore, I think we cannot possibly have any notion of being a net contributor to change when we are bound up with the fault lines that create the mess in the first place. And we're still not willing to do that. And actually, if you want to see an example of that, then just simply look at how people voted, because what we had, for whatever you think about Jeremy Corbyn, was on one hand, someone who was prepared to have a national conversation and to wrestle with empire and legacy, versus someone who essentially is an English nationalist, who wants to reify and in many respects almost glory in our mythologized notion of being exceptional. And how do people vote? They voted for that, including Christians. So actually, that one of the things that we have to wrestle with is that we are not necessarily part of the solution. We are also part of the problem at the same time.
This idea of the necessity of the national conversation around this really interests me. I caused a bit of a sensation or controversy, whatever you want to describe it, last January by bringing up the role of Winston Churchill, and particularly in the Bengal famine. So within about 3 hours of having a quote-unquote discussion with Piers Morgan about that on Good Morning Britain, 40,000 people tweeted me. The Daily Mail were outside my parents' house. I received huge numbers of death threats. I had to send my staff home from my office. And I was doing that from the position of immense privilege, being a white man in elected office. It was actually dangerous for me to say, but Churchill deliberately made a famine worse that killed 4 million people in our empire. So I'm wondering, what do you think that national conversation needs to look like, culturally and politically? How does this actually happen? And what does it look like for the church in particular when we're having that discussion at the same time as talking to the developing world about how, as you say, and how Barry was saying, they need to develop differently, but they're still dealing with the scars of our empire. There are people alive today who were tortured by the British Empire during decolonisation in Africa. So what does that conversation actually look like? We know it's necessary. How do we actually do it?
I think there are a variety of places where that can happen. I think one of the key places, it needs to happen within our national curriculum. It's interesting that those on the right, particularly when Michael Gove was Educational Secretary, says, well, we need to teach British history. Fine, let's teach British history, but let's teach all aspects of British history, and not just like the mythologized triumphalist bit. Because actually, the significances of change will come not with a particular generation that have been embedded on exceptionalism. It comes by conscientizing our young people to believe that there are ways of being British that are not predicated upon exploitation or upon a myth of exceptionalism. So part of that conversation, I think, starts with our school curriculum, and it starts with the fact that British history is multifaceted. There are various stories. What we tend to get is a single narrative, and we know the dangers of a single narrative. That one of the reasons why in our gospel, in the Bible, we have 4 gospels, is because we know that one narrative doesn't do. There are lots of different perspectives that show a variety of nuances and perspectives. So firstly, it needs to be a conversation, I think, within education. I think secondly, it needs to be a conversation within our kind of civic life. And you're absolutely right, that actually what's happened, there's a great quote by, oh gosh, never just escape my, black journalist writes for The Guardian. Gary Young, thank you very much. Gary Young, thank you. And Gary Young says this, he says, the fundamental problem with Brexit is it has poured arsenic into the water supply of our public discourse. Poured arsenic, so therefore, in your experience, even to try to raise issues. So it's interesting how, for example, now our barometers move so far to the right that the kind of hate speech that would have been appalled, it would have appalled us 30, 40 years ago. That's not to say people might not, I don't say people were not probably thinking it, but they wouldn't have dared said it publicly. And now, of course, it's the point whereby you can not only say it publicly, you can put it publicly with no consequences whatsoever. So you can talk about Muslim women as letterboxes. And it has no dint upon your electability. Not one dint at all. You can talk about black people with watermelon and Piccadilly smiles. And that has no impact whatsoever. Because we are now in a point whereby racism has been emboldened. Xenophobia is almost like the new norm. And so we have to find a way in which we can have a conversation where we are honest about the fact that there are many communities that feel left behind because they have not seen the fruits of globalization. I understand that. I come from one of those areas in terms of inner city Bradford. I understand that. Well, first things first, hearing people's stories doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with it, but we have to find a way of being able to listen. And in the classic words of Martin Luther King, to disagree without being disagreeable. At the moment, what we have is such a poisonous atmosphere that even when someone like yourself, just, I mean, it is a historical fact. It's not a myth. Britain consciously enabled that famine to happen. It is a historical fact, but somehow what we have now in our new normal is alternative facts. In the old days, that was just called lies. It was just a lie, but now it's an alternative fact. And therefore, even a common sense of decency that says that how we use language has to be challenged. It's important to remember, and I don't say to be alarmist, it's a historical fact again, that Adolf Hitler was elected by a democratic means in 1933. And long before the gas chambers happened, what you had was this drip incremental change in how people describe Jewish people. So it starts with the language. It starts with the acceptability of using terms that would have been abhorrent in a previous era. And that drip, drip, drip desensitizes people to the point whereby you end up seeing the other as somehow less than human, and therefore it's fair game. I'm not saying that we're going to end up being as bad as Adolf Hitler. But what I'm saying is that we need vigilance. And actually, again, a very simple dictum is that old adage that for evil to flourish, all it requires is for good people to do nothing. Therefore, when we allow hate speech happen, when we allow people to be shouted down, when we allow, for example, I shared a panel a few weeks ago with Rachel, can't remember a second about, she's the woman who was on Question Time, like she was academic at Edge Hill in Liverpool, who raised a question about Meghan Markle, not question, she raised the issue of Meghan Markle facing racism. And that intellectual expert on race called Lawrence Fox, who clearly has done a PhD and written lots of books about it, who knows everything about it from his entitled position, gets up and then shouts her down. And here's the key thing. The BBC presenter, whose name I can't remember, but does Antiques Roadshow, which I will not be watching anymore. Says, well, of course, I'm not taking sides, I'm not taking sides, but of course, Priti Patel, that other great expert on race issues, she said it's not racism. Therefore, this woman who does it for a living, teaches race equality in Edge Hill, gets shouted down in a polite programme that's about public debate. So actually what we need is to recalibrate ourselves and to say, actually, what is decent speech? What is decency? What ways of speaking will we not accept as acceptable or as the norm? And how then do we listen to each other? That I think one of the potential problems of this gathering here, and this is, this is not fault of the organisers, is that all of us, if we're honest, find ourselves in a variety of forms of echo chambers, where we largely populate ourselves with the people who reflect and reinforce our own worldview. I mean, that's not a fault of JP. I'm sure that people were, from a whole variety of perspectives, were encouraged to come. But by and large, I would assume that most of us are here because we see there's a problem that needs to be changed. But the truth is, there are lots of people who just think this is ridiculous. And we have to find a way of how do we have a conversation with those.
Thanks very much for that. To move on to the issue of climate specifically itself before we tie it all back together, you said something really interesting right at the start of that, the opening contribution through in the main hall, of how the church hasn't led on this issue, despite the fact that we should have, and we do have, this profound understanding of creation and creator. Mm-hmm. I'd like to phrase the question around this slightly differently to you. I'd be interested, do you think that the way the church has now, in the last few years, engaged with issues of the climate crisis, we've done so using the same humanist and secular language that others have, and that has been a failure to add another powerful perspective to the conversation? What language should we be using when we are talking about the climate emergency as Christians, as the church?
I want to switch the question slightly, which is obviously what politicians do. So you've asked a question that I don't think I can answer, so let me give you another question instead that I can. Actually, I think part of the problem is not that we've used secular language. Part of the problem is that even when we've thought of it theologically, we have thought of it purely from a humanocentric perspective. That's one of our fundamental problems, even when we do theology, is that we are still too embedded into what many scholars call sort of dominion theology. So dominion theology actually comes from Genesis, that basically God creates the creation of the world and gives it to human beings to be stewards of. But we have dominion of it. That's the language that assumes that somehow we have control of it. And part of our theological flaw is this assumption that somehow God loves us more than God really loves all the animals and everyone else in the creation. So therefore, God's image is in human beings, but not necessarily within the rest of creation. And therefore, what we have worked theologically with is this notion that God is outside of creation. So here's the world, and God is kind of, this being is beyond time and space. I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm saying that one of the implications of that is it has allowed us to fetishize creation, that it is this thing that we have dominion with and we can do as we please because God has given us permission to do so. And actually, and because God's separate from it, if we despoil it, then actually we're not harming God. What we have to reorientate ourselves theologically is to say, yes, it is creation that God has given. But God doesn't give to us, God gave us to the whole of the animal kingdom. Part of our problem when we theologize around this is that we still think in terms of ourselves as being better than and superior to the rest of the nation. So just as I think Britain has a kind of exceptionalism, I think there's a broadly humanocentric exceptionalism that we operate with ourselves. Therefore, I think one of the things that we have to repent of is that we have tried to we have fashioned the creation to suit us and sod the rest of creation, all the animals and other beings, plant life, trees, etc., etc., etc. And reorientation, therefore, says that God cares about all of that. So there's a fantastic song online, if you can find it. It's by an African-American a cappella group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, which some of you may be familiar with Sweet Honey in the Rock. And they have a song called If the Earth Could Run Away. And what they do is that they give the earth a personality and say, if the earth could speak, the earth would say, you know, I just want to run away from these human beings, because quite frankly, you have never treated me with respect, and the earth is almost like an abused woman. And humans are the abusers. And basically, the earth wants to run away, and God runs away with the earth and says, you know, human beings, we'll leave it to your own devices, because maybe you can never change. Now, I played that to church groups, and of course, they're all Paul, because, you know, we can't imagine the earth having a personality, it's just a thing. If we see God within it, we think, oh, it's a heresy. It becomes pantheism, it becomes some type of theological flaw, because we see God as being beyond creation. What if we imagine that God was just rooted within it and there was no other place that God could go? Therefore, protecting the creation is about protecting God also. A God who's vulnerable and God who can be hurt. A God who works in partnership with us and grieves when we despoil the planet because we're doing harm to God's self. God is not impermeable and inviolate and untouchable and impassible and all these theological things that people thought up. Theological categories they're thought up. Thinking still imperialistic terms of hierarchy. So there's God, and there's the angels, and then there's human beings, and then there's creation at the bottom. But what if we're all of us tied in together? And therefore, it's not just self-interest that says that we should look after creation. It's actually part of our devotion to God that says that we want to look after the planet because God is embedded within it, and that's part of our expression and our devotion to God. So people say, oh yeah, but that's about worshipping nature. I can think of worse things that we can do. Actually done that, quite frankly. Because actually what we've done at the moment actually is worship money and make that sound like it's okay.
That's a neat segue to the last question I've got before we throw it open. I'm interested in how we strike the balance between as a church ensuring that all are welcome within the church, but being absolutely clear on where and how and whose side we are to take. You mentioned in the opening contribution in the main hall, fundamental questions around neoliberalism and capitalism itself, things that are so utterly normalised within our society, that for the church to question something as foundational to Western liberal democracies as capitalism and as neoliberalism has been for the last few decades, instinctively makes a substantial number of people recoil somewhat and question why we as a church should be doing that, and is that pushing people away from the church? Mm-hmm. So it's the tension between ensuring that all are welcome, but actually asking these fundamental questions about that need for transformation. How do we balance that, as certainly the denominations represented here all have a desire to be broad churches in one sense or another?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things I want to say very quickly. I think first is the reality that all of us are sinful. That all of us are acceptable to God because God is gracious and God is just, not because somehow we've earned it more than anyone else. And so therefore I know there's a kind of liberal lefty, which I'm all those things, presumption that somehow we are the really righteous people, you know? I live in Moseley, Birmingham. If everyone knows Birmingham, B13, Moseley. Essentially, we're at the Guardian reading, Observer reading, folk who are just on the right side of the argument. I mean, we just are, you know? If people just read my books a little bit more, the kingdom of heaven would be that bit closer, you know? So firstly, it has to start with that the reason why we are trying to be broad and inclusive is because that's who God is. That all of us come to church, or we become part of church, not because we deserve to be there, but because God welcomes us irrespective of all our flaws. So that I think that's important to say. That yes, I am partisan, but I'm partisan on the basis of my partial view of God, because actually none of our theology speaks absolutely for God, that theology is human speech about God. God doesn't do theology, so God is beyond that. So that's the first thing to say. But actually, I think it's also important to say, and so my all-time hero is a guy called James Cone. So if you may be familiar with James Cone, is the inventor of black liberation theology. Some people dispute it, but he is the inventor. And Cone says, well, the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition doesn't do fairness. God does justice. There is right and wrong. There are oppressed and the oppressors. God takes sides. What we have to do as a church is, yes, be welcoming and be loving and embrace people with their differences, but still be clear that we are called to take sides. There is sin in the world. There is injustice. There is exploitation. We read the scriptures, and this is not an impartial God that says, well, you know, here we go. So there's exploiter and exploited. But I'm not going to take sides. I think there are valid points on both. No. That's not how God works. It's uncomfortable sometimes to read it. But actually, God says, I am making a decisive position. Doesn't mean I don't love everybody, but it means I have a preferential option for those who are most marginalized and oppressed. That's what the church has not done, because partly like we've been caught up with empire. Partly as well, I think that what we also suffered from, certainly in Britain, is this sense of a form of bourgeois middle-class respectability politics. So we're more concerned about being seen to be not nice. So, no, put another way. We would rather be wrong and nice than be seen to be making an opinion that might upset people, but speaking truth to power. I think I'm fortunate, and I'm doing that generally, to be a layperson, because it means that I don't have any authority in the church. I never have to stand up as an authority figure and try to represent a tradition that is, on the one hand, trying to manage itself in the public square and not offend people, and yet at a certain point sort of trying to be faithful to the gospel. I think fundamentally, the last thing I want to say very quickly is, so long as we see church as a consumer model, we will always be in trouble. See, a consumer model gives people what they want. So even in our Effect for Growth, I can talk as a Methodist, what we're trying to do is to offer a consumer model that says, what's the kind of church that will get people to come into us? But where's the prophetic challenge there? Because actually, how it works is that we are confirmed and molded into God's way of being, not the other way around. And therefore, prophetic challenge of being uncomfortable is the gospel. To be a disciple, pick up your cross and follow me. There's nothing cozy about that. So long as we think in terms of consumer models, we will always feel it difficult to take a prophetic stance because for fear of offending people. But actually, last time I checked, the scriptures are full of people who were challenged by God to speak truth to power and offended people greatly along the way. Here's the thing. To quote my mum, who's still probably like the best theologian I've ever come across, my mum used to always say, the truth may cause offence, but the truth is never a sin. Now, admittedly, part of our collective wrestling then is to discern what the truth is, and it's more than any one particular group. So as good as my books are, and trust me, please buy my books because I'm a genius, I'm not in possession of the truth. The truth is collectively what the Spirit of God is laying on God's people in order to be salt and light, to be a difference, to be an example, not out of exceptionalism, but out of humility.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So at this point we've got just about 20 minutes for questions.
It seems to me that the church has been very much focused on, influenced by Greek philosophy and so on, and the sort of dichotomy between the Cartesian dualism, basically, whereas Africa and Mi'kmaq, for example, or native Indian approaches to spirituality are much more holistic, and in the first place have much more respect for nature. Yet Christians have gone on and said, well,
sure. So
you're not very civilized. You need to do it like us.
Yeah.
And actually, they were
sorry to cut you off, just say, for the sake of time, we'll take these questions as a group.
Sure.
That was a nice and light one to start off with. If anyone didn't hear, so the first question was about... Yeah, so that question was about epistemology, and...
I'll explain the term.
Yeah, Anthony will explain that because he's far smarter than me. And then we've got the second question up the back there.
It's not so much a question, but a recommendation. I'm actually reading a book called A New Climate from Theology by Sally McFay, and it pretty well says everything that Anthony has said this morning. And I would really recommend to anybody who's interested in climate change and theology.
Great. So when you buy Anthony's book, you can buy that book as well.
That book is probably cheaper than mine.
And is there a third question that we could take as part?
Repeat the title again, please.
Yeah, sorry, could you just repeat the title of the book?
A New Climate for Theology, God, the World and Global Warming.
So A New Climate for Theology, God, the World and Global Warming.
Another big word, it's not the end of the world if you don't know what it means. Eschatology, there are scriptures which say, you know, the world and all the works in it are going to be burnt up. So what is the point? I mean, there are quite strong strands of church tradition, and in the present day, particularly I dislike them using the word because it's what I like to use about myself, but the evangelicals in America, I'm not one of them, but those are, you know, what's all the point of this? They have this dominion theology, and they match that with get saved, go to heaven when you die. That's the purpose of the gospel. Can we synthesize that with creation care and the important things you talked about justice and so on?
Sure. Okay, so essentially, there's two questions there, because the second one was a recommendation. But a very, very good book, by the way. I mean, I've read the book, and it's a fantastic book. Yeah, so first question. So, epistemology, big, long word, simply means truth, and how do we know truth? Knowledge. How do we know that? And it's undoubted that what the church has done, it has drunk very deeply from Greek philosophical thought in terms of how we know. And the truth is, how we know is hierarchical. So actually what often gets done in terms of knowledge, it is done by experts who create new categories, new ideas, which then cascade themselves down. So what we often mean when we talk about epistemology, or let's just talk about a certain type of philosophical knowledge, it's done by people like myself, academics. It has lots of problems. Some of it is actually that binary. Some of it is that sense in which that the abstract is more important than the material. Universal concepts are more important than particularity. Rationality is affirmed much more so than being and feelings and other ways of knowing. I think what you get in many other cultures is another type of knowledge, and this is actually the piece of research I'm working on at the moment, which is what's called phronesis. What that simply means is practical wisdom. How do you learn through experience, just through engaging in life? And actually what we've seen in many parts of the world are people who have a profound knowledge of the world, not because someone has sat down and looked at it as a discrete academic subject, disembodied from experience. They've rooted themselves in experience, and they just know stuff. So I saw them going to Australia in 2011 to do some teaching there and talk to Aboriginals whose connection with the land meant that they knew stuff about plants and biology and various other things. It's not just that, you find it in Africa and Latin America. There are other ways of knowing. And actually what those cultures have always had to teach us is that if you are embedded in nature and it's a partner, and basically that creation almost has a personality in itself, then you treat it very differently than if you see yourself as a discrete category, as I said before, as human beings, and somehow this other thing is just there at our behest, and we can treat it as we feel like it, because God really elevates us and downplays creation of other beings. Therefore, I think one of the things that we have to wrestle with is that Greek inheritance. A fantastic book, probably one of the best books about that, is Required Books. Not one of mine, let me just say. It's by a guy called Robert Hood. And the book is called Must God Remain Greek? Must God Remain Greek? And maybe what he started to say in brackets, Must God Remain White and Western? And what he does is he looks at different other forms of knowledge and spirituality that come from other parts of the world that are not based upon this hierarchical abstraction that comes after Greek philosophical thought. And actually, that book, first published in 1994, so it's not a new book, but obviously not particularly well known if you're not into kind of black liberationists and post-colonial circles. But actually, that's a really helpful book, because what it says is, it says that part of our problem is that we've been trapped in a particular inheritance that comes from the Greek via St. Paul. I mean, Paul did some good things, but he did some things that were not quite so helpful. And actually, and the sense of how we know of God through a particular prism of Greek philosophical thought hasn't helped us. In terms of the second question about eschatology, oh, absolutely. In terms of the end times, in terms of what happens at the end of history. Dominion theology is a particular expression, I think, of American fundamentalism. It's their reaction to modernity. That's why European evangelicals are very different, because we just found a different way of handling the challenges of modernity and other ways of, again, it goes back to knowledge and other ways of knowing. Therefore, there are other ways of reading what's going to happen at the end of time. Clearly, if one holds to a view that God and what God will do at the end of time is fundamentally God's business, but we have a responsibility to be working on this side of history in order to meet God as God's coming back in the other direction. I mean, it gets a bit complicated. But essentially, what I think we have to say is that there is another, that part of their reading is part of their own history, but it's also a very elite one, because actually, if you also link to that a theology of election, so it's this notion that God is going to save particular sets of people, and of course it's used of the people who are saying it, that God's going to save. You know, it's a kind of a very circular argument. And so therefore, when they're saying that in the basis that they believe that, like the rest of the world that's usually dark skinned, because these people who believe that are usually dying the world racist anyway. So as far as they're concerned, God's going to abandon the rest of the world and will save them. It's also interesting that some of the work that gets done around trying to explore other planets is also done by these same people. So actually, the other way of framing this theologically, through technologies, they say, if we can develop certain kind of spaceships that help us to colonize another world, you know where they're going to go and who they're going to leave behind. And basically, it's all the ones that they don't like, which is probably most of us in this room here.
Fantastic. So the questions I've got, I'm going to do two sets of two. If we could be really brief with the answers to these, because I know there are more people who want to ask questions in the front. So, no, don't apologise, it's very interesting. I feel smarter already for having been in this room. First questions are in fair trade and the economics of empire, the economics of post-empire. Although we've just come to the end of fair trade fortnight, it feels that fair trade seems to have lost the profile that it had a few years ago. So do you think that the prevalence of cheaper non-fair trade goods like food, the unwillingness of consumers to pay fair trade prices is a modern incarnation of empire? And the second question I'm grouping with this one is primarily an observation that we as Christians are a movement of over 2 billion people. We can, purely as a matter of scale, play a transformational role in the climate crisis if as a movement we threw ourselves at it. If we did so on an interfaith basis, there are 3-4 billion other people we could be working with. So how do we build these alliances? How do we build that movement as a movement of faith to tackle the climate crisis?
Okay, I'll take the second one first, because I think it's a bit easier to answer. That essentially, I think what this moment gives us is a huge refining concern. That essentially, without this planet, we are nothing. Without change, we are nothing. It almost puts everything else almost into some kind of petty insignificance. It is that significant. And actually, and therefore what we share with everyone, of faith and no faith, is this planet. Therefore, there should be a natural synergy between different religions, because what all of them say, or which is not to collapse them into some type of sort of lazy relativism, is essentially that God is a creator. And we have to do better in terms of our stewardship. That should be a natural lens for interfaith cooperation, because actually what it challenges is, as I said in the panel, is that kind of hubris that sees short-term gain and growth. And it's interesting that all the advocates of growth pretend that it's really about lifting millions out of poverty, but actually what it's really about is making themselves rich. It's intensely selfish. And therefore what we need to do, because I think faith is fundamentally about our relationship to God and to others, irrespective of the religious perspective, is that it should give us a natural common ground, because we are literally on a common ground, this earth that God has given us, that we have to somehow drastically change our ways in order to affect the future. I think in terms of the first question...
So fair trade.
Yeah, fair trade.
Normalised.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in that I'm no economist, but I mean, I do go to a sort of cooperative film club, which is pretty much B13 Mosley lefties all turn up and watching a film that makes us feel bad. In order that we can then go away and make other people feel bad also. But I like it. But it's interesting in that I've seen a few films that have been about sort of cooperative forms of economics. And basically what it says is that selfishness doesn't even make sense economically. It just doesn't make sense economically. If, for example, here's the thing. We are told, economics 101, when I did economics a long time ago, I wasn't very good at it, but I did economics, that somehow, if you have too much labour, wages go down. They don't have to go down. That's just greed. Actually, if you pay people a fair wage, guess what? They then wouldn't need to buy cheap goods. Therefore, we could have better economics that paid people a living wage. That one of the arguments around why people buy or we need cheap imports is because what we have is work poverty. People who are in full-time jobs but are still poor. So therefore, this myth of hard work and ingenuity is of course a lie. Because actually, if hard work and ingenuity made people rich, then every African woman on the planet would be the richest person in the world, because no one works harder than they do. Therefore, I think what's interesting, if you look at Acts chapter 2, what we have is a model of cooperative ways of living. That one of the things I often say to some of my students is, but probably liberation theology is full of Marxism. Like that's the worst thing in the world either, by the way. As a form of social analysis, not necessarily in terms of as a planned economy. It was tried in the East to various degrees and it had major problems, of course it did. But actually, long before Marx was thinking up stuff, what we have is Acts chapter 2. Of people living things, holding things in common. That's not a Marxist idea, that's a Christian idea. So what would happen if we had the economics of cooperation? Of not excess, because obviously profits and excess take no account of human need, as our economic speaker who's never forgotten, was next to me on the panel said, and Podker said, far more in the company than I am. Okay. Therefore, fair trade is not just about political credit, it just makes sense. Greed is part of our sinfulness that works because it works for a few people, but what it does, of course, it buys off just enough of the middle class to convince us that it's a system that works for all of us. But of course it's a myth. It only supports a tiny minority. And therefore I think if we had different types of social arrangements, but not coercions, that's where I'm a socialist, but I'm a Christian socialist, because I think what various forms of planned economy have shown us is that if you leave people to their own devices, we are selfish. We don't mind sharing, but we are very discriminating about who we want to share with. What the gospel and the power of the Spirit says is that when God breaks our will and makes us loving, we then share not because we want to be discriminated about who we share with. We share because we know that God loved us first. And we are compelled to do it. Paul says something, I think it's in Ephesians, where it says, the love of Christ constrains us. That's what we need to hold on to, is the belief that in the regulating and transforming power of the Spirit.
Awesome, thank you very much. I'm going to try and get these last two written questions in, and I saw a hand up at the back that I'll take as well. We're going to run into lunch ever so slightly, but we'll be super quick about these. So the first one is just a very straightforward question about how do we as Christians, and particularly interested in your perspective of this, say as a lay member of the church, how do we as Christians, members of our churches, get our denominations at every level to put climate justice at the top of the agenda internally within the church? This is a really interesting one. How can we learn to imagine and speak about God in ways that will help us change the world? I.e., is the language that we use in theology and worship part of the problem? And I said I would take the question right up at the back from yourself.
Yeah, it seems to me that we have, as humans, always been trying to separate ourselves. So first of all, we separated ourselves from the rest of creation. The plant, animal, bacterial kingdom, we said, no, we're not like them. And then we separated men from women, so we're not like them. And then we separated different races, and said we're not like them. And we separate according to sexuality. So it seems to me that there's something about identity behind the climate crisis and the economic crisis. And I wonder whether theology is in a position, is theology maybe the only discourse in a position to completely rewrite the terms of debate so that it's no longer about separation in any terms, human from creation, one kind of human from another kind, haves from have-nots, and instead it's about a common identity in God. And is theology the only discourse that can do that? And if so, how?
Okay, well, so as a theologian, I'm tempted to say, of course it is. But I'm not sure if it's the only one or the best. I think it has a particular role to play. I think I would say that. And I would combine that question with the one around how we do theology, and is language the problem? Language is loaded. Language is never neutral. Language doesn't describe the world. It prefigures what we imagine is possible. Quote from another book, not my book again, just to say. So there's a book by two of my friends, Michael Jagassar and Stephen Burns. The book is simply called Christian Worship. Christian Worship, published by Equinox about 2012. And what they look at how we talk about God is significant in shaping our imagination. And so therefore what they do, they wrestle with some of those notions of separation and some of those binaries in order to say, so let me give an example. By talking about the kingdom of God, and although we know it is different from other kingdoms, the problem is, in our mind, it evokes still notions of hierarchy, and we still play with that in our church structures and our church orders. Therefore, people sometimes talk about the household of God. Sometimes people actually talk about the economy of God, actually God's way of moving in creation amongst us that generates particular activity. At one level, people say, oh, that's just political correctness. But actually, normally it's people who are powerful who say that. I remember growing up at a time where I was coloured. And people were spatsticks and Mongols. Tell them that language doesn't matter. Language tells us something about our values, but it tells us something about our moral imagination. And therefore, what the book Christian Worship, there are other books as well. There's obviously like the hugely famous one by Walter Brueggemann called The Prophetic Imagination that some of you will have read. And so Walter Brueggemann says actually that one of the quintessential things that God has always given us is this imagination to see the world differently. The imagination to see the world differently, and that's what our tradition at best have done. It's to say that we're in the world but not of it. And by that, I don't mean that we absent ourselves. What it means is that we are not constrained by the existing moral values that come from a majority world that says that this is how it can be, or this is the only way it can be. There are other ways it can be. And therefore, I think it is about how we change our language. It's about how we rethink some of the categories by which we've thought about God. So, as I said this earlier in this session and on the platform, if you start from a basis, as you correctly said, of us being separate from, and somehow the creation, earth and other plant-based things are just for our disposal, they have no integrity in and of themselves, their only purpose is to serve us, then of course by definition actually you're going to mistreat it. If you see it as being significant to yourself, and therefore part of what I want to hold on to is both particularity and universality. I don't want to lose what makes us or particular groups particular. That's important. But actually, it's also this sense of, all the way through the scriptures, what we see also is God reconciling all things to God's self. And there are various images in Revelation and in Isaiah of the whole household coming together. And we come together because God invites us. Part of what I want to say actually comes from, again, one of my heroes, Gustavo Gutierrez, who says that when we talk about God's preferential option for the marginalized and the poor and the oppressed, it's not because somehow the marginalized, poor and oppressed are just morally superior beings. Actually, history does not tell us that. History tells us that if you give poor people a chance to take over power, they don't behave any better than the people who preceded them. God's preferential option is because God is just and righteous. And therefore what we have to work in partnership with is God's righteousness that wants to put this right and wants us to be better stewards of the thing that God gave us in the first place. And that cannot be done if we think ourselves as being separate from other human beings and for other creatures, and we're in this mess together. And also when I say that, I mean that much more intently than anything that David Cameron meant when he said that we're all in this together. And then brought in austerity that scuppered the pub. I think maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you for watching this recording from the JPIT National Conference 2020. For more great resources, visit our website, jointpublicissues.org.uk.